Now, the insights of Jay Martin on our world. Society and politics. The Jay Martin interview. We're on the 107 stream welcoming you again, Jay Martin, James Martin. And we're going to talk about Boris Johnson, actually, is one of the things, because he is, it's kind of like he's doing a grab for power or something. So first we talk about his changing room exploits. So why does he? I wonder why he wants to redecorate 10 Downing Street so badly when it's already had some good stuff in there and also furniture from John Lewis. Why would you want to get rid of that?
Well, the key thing with Boris Johnson is like other prime ministers. So I'll play fair for just now. There is an allowance that's given to prime ministers. It's about £30,000 per year to redecorate their apartment, which is actually most prime ministers tend to live in the apartments above number 11 Downing Street. So whilst 30,000 is a hell of a lot more than I earn per year, there is, whether we agree with that or not, there is a sort of public purse available. There
is that allowance, yeah.
He went out and said that the reason for redecorating is that Theresa May had basically turned it into a John Lewis paradise kind of thing, and has redecorated. But I suppose there's a few questions here about. It seems Johnson is, well, it seems that he doesn't like paying for anything. Everything that he's wanted, he's outwardly received some sorts of donations from people who are in his party, supporters of his party. That I think it's more of an attempt at being clever to hide what we're talking about here, which is corruption. One of the key arguments with cutting foreign aid, for example, was that monies end up in corrupt hands, and we've heard, I think it was Lesotho or East Swatini, as we should now call it, Swaziland, sorry, but both countries, we have seen articles in the press that £1 million was given to one of the countries, and it just so happens that that country spent £1 million on a presidential royal party. You have to correct me on the details of that, but we've then seen various stories that money that's given to other countries has ended up in the wrong hands and has been used for personal gain. We call that corruption. That's what the UK media calls it, is what I would call it. Apart from when it seems to be going on right here in the UK, where it's not corruption, it's donations. It's it's just Boris. He wants to redecorate his house so it looks like it looked like a melted down traffic cone to me when I saw some of the images. But hey, everyone's entitled to their own taste. But this is much more than redecoration. This is in your face corruption. And that's what we should be referring it to.
But he maintains that he actually did spend his own money or something on it. He would have a lot of money other than the 30,000. He'd have money of his own, wouldn't he? So why would he even have to do this?
Well, I suppose once the money's hit your account, I suppose it is your money. But I don't know. Either he's extremely poor and impoverished and can't afford the amounts that he wants to spend, which I find very doubtful, by the way. Or, as I say, it's nothing to do with that. It's to do with key donors funneling money into the Conservative Party, specifically to that party and him, it's nothing to do with redecoration. It's to do with sleaze. It's pay for favours. We've been here before in Britain. It's dominated John Major's and even a bit of Thatcher's tenure as Prime Minister. Cash for access, cash for questions, plagued New Labour as well. But this is another variation. I mean, we've also heard of various text messages, WhatsApp from David Cameron, James Dyson, for example. And I always feel sorry for the company that manufactures the Henry Hoover, who are based in the UK, source their steel from Wales, haven't moved offshore for neither tax purposes nor cheaper and exploited labour. We've been told, oh, well, Dyson, we were sorting out his tax because he was making ventilators. To date, with the money he has received in non-tax collection, we are yet to see any form of Dyson respirator. None have been produced, zero. But again, what we're talking about is corruption. And I was just having a quick look before we started recording the interview to see whether or not any stories had hit number one in any of the newspapers around corruption. And it's very strange how we've moved immediately away from Johnson. We're back onto David Cameron around this Greensill company. Which again was a sham company established to funnel public money into private hands, and a little cut of that no doubt ends up in the hands of Boris Johnson.
It was also a bit like that ferry thing, wasn't it, last year, about the ferry contracts with no actual ferries.
Yeah, well, this is it. I mean, look, here we go. We've got all of these issues in terms of corruption. We've got, constant attacks in the press. I've just seen an article there about benefit fraud, which is historically, anyway, at very low levels. So we're on to benefit frauds. Well, hold on. We're talking about perhaps the issue of public spending wouldn't be such a problem if we bothered to collect tax from people who are making millions. So anyone who's listening to this, if you work, have a look at your pay slip, look at the amount of tax, national insurance contributions that you've made. See that amount and just remind yourself that you've paid more tax than Amazon has ever in this country.
It's amazing that, isn't it? You know, with it must be billions that they make, and yet because of the arrangements, I'm not sure if it's because they're registered in the Channel Islands, like Play.com was registered there. They've now gone, but they used to sell, DVDs and things like that, didn't they? So they were like an Amazon competitor, and they were registered there to avoid tax. So it must be a similar thing that Amazon have been doing.
Yeah, well, this is it, and it's not just Amazon. You know, you've got other companies that have special tax arrangements. We know about Starbucks, we know about Boots, we know about Tesco. In fact, we could be here all day going through the companies that you use that pay next to nothing. Amazon's in my sights for the way that they treat their staff, for the total monopoly of particular markets now, just operating completely unchecked.
Yeah,
and yet you don't have the ability to text the Prime Minister or the Chancellor or anything like that to arrange some private tax deal. Look, this is corruption. This is unfettered access to the country's leaders who are accepting money from donors for redecoration. I think I was reading something about childcare costs, or he'd not been able to get some money for that. this is Johnson, but everything else seems to be a free ride. Donors pay him. He can afford it. Of course he can. And certainly on his salary as a Prime Minister to be able to afford it, on top of the amount of money that his office gets to redecorate the flat. His rebuttal of Tony Blair I thought was interesting. Tony Blair is not one of my favourite people. I personally think he's a war criminal, amongst much more. But he said, oh, well, Tony Blair took 300 and odd £1,000, and what's wrong with me doing that? Well, the answer is he was there for 10 years, and again, just multiply 30,000 by 10. It's not...
Yeah, 300,000.
That point is not... It's if, you know, I do understand that if you are the leader of a country, I do understand that you need some finance in order to live in, you know, what is essentially an apartment above number 10, number 11. Wow. I do understand that, but £30,000.
It's amazing, isn't it? So it's more than what most people would get in a year, most, and it's also to redecorate. It's just to do that, and it's only. I mean, how big is the flat actually? That's an interesting question. I mean, it's not like a mansion, but is it bigger than the average apartment? I mean, it looks like a terrace street, doesn't it? 10 Downing Street. Is it a big deal to redecorate it?
Well, it won't surprise you to learn that I've not been invited up to the apartments of number 11 nor number 10. From what we can gather, though, they're not spacious, but much bigger than anything I've ever lived in when I've lived in apartments and flats and what have you. So, look, £30,000, it's a lot of money. This is public purse stuff. If you can't decorate your house with that amount, I think you've got a serious problem. But of course, to these people, 30,000 is it barely registers. It's loose change. Because
how much does he get though? Because you get MPs voted their own increase, didn't they? For wasn't the allowance? Didn't it used to be something like £65,000? And this is in addition to their income each year. So this redecorating, the allowance for the flat. But they used to get 65,000 a year, MPs, and it's gone up to, isn't it, 90,000? Is there any difference between that and what the Prime Minister's salary is? Is that higher?
Well, the Prime Minister's salary is, of course, much higher than MPs. So, shadow ministers receive additional bump ups, but the Prime Minister, I think this was as of last year, it was it's somewhere in the region of 161,000. I believe that's gone up to 165 this year. If ever the term gravy train was to be used, it's here. The basic salary of MPs as of April of this year is 81,000.
Or 81, right?
Yeah.
I'm
sure. By the way, if we were to have MPs' salaries linked to increases in the minimum wage, they'd probably think twice.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that's been big about Boris Johnson as well, is a little bit concerning, as well as this thing. We'll go into the Fixed Term Parliament Act as well, and what he might do there, because his government is trying to change that. There's there's this thing about voter fraud as well, and changing the way that we'll be allowed to vote, and forcing people to bring documents along, voter ID, to tackle voter fraud, so-called, that is in very low numbers. So, what are they trying to do there? What are they trying to do to how it is that you're going to be able to vote, which could be to the advantage of the Conservative Party, I presume?
Again, what this is doing, this is really turning the UK into a miniature version of a large number of states in the US. What we've got is, I mean, firstly, let's just have a look at the facts here before we continue. So, the number of convictions for voter fraud in the 2019 general election The grand total was 1.
Just 1.
Which constitutes, so if you've just heard me tapping in the background, it constitutes a 0.0000002% of all electors.
Unless there were so many undetected cases, I mean, would they actually use that argument? Do you think if you have, when you're not a Conservative MP or to do with Boris Johnson's cabinet, is that how they would report that? But those are just the ones we managed to catch, but it's actually a huge problem of all those undetected ones that you wouldn't show up in the statistics from this extraordinarily low amount of people who have actually been caught doing it. That one case that you say that there was.
There was 1 conviction and 0 cautions in 2019. You'd expect to see more cautions than convictions for any fraud, and yet, Johnson's the ID plan is likely to impact 2.3 million potential voters.
And making it difficult or impossible for them to vote, you mean?
Well, this is another attack on the working class. If you don't drive, if you catch public transport or, you cyclists, whatever. By the way, cyclists, tone down the lycra. But if you're a cyclist, you walk to work, public transport, why would you have a driving license? And if you've never left the UK or you can't afford to go on holiday outside of the UK or travel outside the UK, why would you need a passport?
So that's 2 documents that that anyone can apply for, but you have to pay for. So you've got provisional driving license. You don't have to pass your test, but you do have to apply for it and pay for the license. And then you've got the passport. I don't know what the figure is can't remember what the figure is for applying for the provisional. It's at least £30, isn't it? And then you've got it used to be £80 when I applied for my passport.
£80, yeah.
It's just run out, actually. There's going to be an awful lot of people who haven't renewed that because of the COVID situation, presumably, and national travel being under question. So it's these 2 these 2 documents that they're going to require: the driving license and the passport as voter ID.
Let's look at it like this. So if we have a look at our friends across the pond, and we look at voter fraud and the arguments the Republicans have used, and some Democrats, let's be fair. What it actually has the effect of, this obsession with ID and you must take ID and whatever else, is firstly it strips that fundamental right to engage in the democratic process. Secondly, it disproportionately affects people who are on lower incomes or can't work. It affects people on the grounds of race, who certainly in the States are often in the previous demographic. So in other words, I tend to look at things as class issues. This is another attack on the working class. If you are in lower income quartiles and all of this, you're less likely to vote Conservative, or if you are, well, it's a sophisticated form of self-harm, perhaps.
Hartlepool. Yeah, I mean, we could talk about Hartlepool in a bit as well, but yeah, just thinking Hartlepool, working class vote. We'll get to that after, though.
More a case of people not coming out to vote, but we can have a look at that in a sec. But this is it's another informal power grab. You see, if headlines read Johnson wishes to restrict your right to vote, perhaps people would take more attention. Instead, it's dressed up as to prevent voter fraud. Now, here's the thing: if there was 1 conviction on the grounds of fraud, well, okay, fair enough. I'm glad to see that we've got systems in place where people can be convicted. What we're not discussing, though, is the huge Cambridge Analytica scandal that still, is going on behind the scenes, the manipulation of voters from external powers, countries that might rhyme with blusher or shiner, who have huge data farms, social media farms, bot networks that influence people when they're accessing social media. Very real effect. Please feel free to read some more on that. If you're listening and not quite sure what I'm talking about, Cambridge Analytica. There's a very good documentary called The Great Hack on Netflix that sort of explains some of this. Oddly enough, I was just teaching the effects of social media just last week, and of course this comes up. So what you've got is this huge attack, these huge influences from the likes of Aaron Banks. Let's name them. Aaron Banks, Cambridge Analytica, all of these sorts, who are influencing us behind the scenes. Well, hold on a second. Isn't that voter fraud? Since when did we tacitly accept that foreign players have the right to interfere in our democratic process? Well, obviously, there's somewhat of an irony there, because that's what Britain and the US and other countries have been doing to other countries for quite a while. It's not so nice when it's when it's happening to us. But I would rather be concentrating on that and the vast fortunes. I mean, the royals, again, we've just seen influence from one of them, I think Prince Michael, his name is, influence with the Russians and all of this. And we've got this very cozy relationship in some quarters with other countries that are vast arrays, thousands of people employed by states to operate bots, whatever it is, to influence the way that you think. And we're talking about, compare, contrast, one conviction of voter fraud in 2019.
And then also
compare and contrast the amount of corruption, and we can't call it fraud, but we can call it corruption, at the very heart of this government, where there is something deeply rotten, where the Prime Minister can accept above £30,000, possibly illegal, to quote Dominic Cummings. I'm sure there's a nice cosy deal with Cummings to keep him quiet. But yes, we've got the John Lewis furniture, neither cheap nor poor quality, that kind of idea, replaced. We've got a Prime Minister who has been quoted as saying, well, there's no denial, which could be admissible in court, but the pile of bodies comments. We've got the massive issues of Brexit. The fishing industry has collapsed, and yet I also recall NHS workers being given an effective pay cut, despite the £350 million pounds a week. Cozy arrangements with businesses, again Dyson, lots of other billionaires, and one person has apparently, this is the illusion that people are given, one person is now a frenzy of voter fraud. I'm sorry, it doesn't exist. This is called voter suppression. They are trying to stop you from voting.
Yeah, and there's one thing he said about ID cards, and although this isn't a general ID card scheme, but a more bureaucracy attached to voting, he said, what did he say? He said that he would slap someone's face with the ID card, didn't he, or something like that? Back in 2004, remember that it was the new Labour government towards the end of the noughties that was proposing a national ID card scheme. Now we have something through the back door being proposed, where you'll have to show identity to vote. They're not proposing that you can use any other documents if you don't have a driving licence or a passport. It's just basically that's it. That's it. You're a person non grata now. You haven't got anything else. So bugger off from this polling station, would you please?
I remember, Captain Brexit himself, David Davis, who staged a little resignation and all of this over the sentencing terms, and of course he then threw in a lot of this ID card stuff. The reality is, when you are born, are you a person, or are you a person until you get a birth certificate or some form of identification? I personally take the view that you're a person without having to provide some card.
Okay, this is what he said anyway, Boris Johnson, back in 2004. If I am ever asked on the streets of London or in any other venue, public or private, to produce my ID card as evidence that I am who I say I am when I have done nothing wrong and when I am simply ambling along and breathing God's fresh air like any other free-born Englishman, then I will take that card out of my wallet and physically eat it in the presence of whatever emanation of the state has demanded that I produce it. So we a symbolic protest could be outside the polling station, couldn't it, to do the very same thing with the driving licence and the passport.
A nearly very good impression there, Michael, I have to say.
Well, I didn't think it was. That's why I was turning it down. But it's just be good to be able to do something like that, though, wouldn't it? I suppose he's making a very good impression of someone who is a libertarian. He likes to label himself as a libertarian, but we're not seeing that much evidence of it now he's Prime Minister, are we?
Well, I don't personally believe that even self-described libertarians necessarily understand its meaning and consequence. And as for same with this, for that matter, Johnson, if Johnson told me today was Thursday, I would still check my calendar to make sure. We've got, at the heart of government, it's not just Johnson. Let's not forget the booklet Britannia Unchained that was issued by Kwasi Kwarteng, Priti Patel, Dominic Raab, Chris Skidmore, Liz Truss. There might have been a few others who were talking about getting rid of the NHS. British workers are amongst the most worst idlers in the world, and all of this. Essentially, what we've got here is this notion, this City of London idea, that only based upon your wealth should you vote. That used to be the situation prior to universal suffrage in this country. You could only vote, or in fact stand as a member of Parliament, based upon your land holdings.
Oh yes, landowners
and wealth. And that's why you have an attack by these Tories who genuinely believe that they are born to rule, and genuinely believe that the working class of this country and others are not just morally inferior, but of course don't work.
I haven't moved on in 200 years or so. Because so when was that situation where it was only landowners and property owners, that are allowed to vote? We're talking the 1800s still, was it?
Well, you've got to look at it from a group called the Chartists, I suppose. There were radical ideas, revolutionary ideas that came from the French Revolution, early 1800s. This fed into the People's Charter, where there were 6 key points that the Chartists were arguing for. Only 5 of the 6 points were ever achieved, and really only achieved. I'll go through the 6 points. So you'll see these weren't achieved all at once. Really weren't fully achieved until probably 48. But a vote for every man aged 21 years or above, of sound mind, not undergoing punishment for a crime, the right to a secret ballot, no property qualification for members of Parliament, MPs being paid, payment of members, equal constituency sizes, and yearly general elections.
So it was men only, but also one thing that has not changed in that 200 years or so, or just less than 200 years, is the prisoners don't have the right to vote still. So if you get sent down for a crime there, you lose your democratic rights as well whilst incarcerated.
You've got in other countries that's not the case, and we know the extent in the US where you lose your right to vote in some states permanently. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the payment of MPs, one of the reasons for that was to enable people of any class to be able to stand in Parliament. I mean, could you spend 5 years of your life That's potentially going to change in the next week. But could you spend 5 years of your life living for free in London?
Well, I mean,
That was the whole idea, that people of any class could stand to be a representative. Well, payment of MPs didn't come until, I wouldn't say the 1910s, 1920s, around that time. I mean, Labour's first MP, Keir Hardie, was supported in terms of payment by the trade union movement. That was how we got people into Parliament back then. But that's the direction we're going back in.
Well, it does seem that way, doesn't it? Well, then women got the right to vote, and then the age went down to 18. But now we're kind of seeing a little bit of a backwards track to it. So that's the assault on the right to vote, demanding a driving licence and passport if this goes through. There's also they always gerrymander the borders as well. They're still doing a bit of that. So changing the constituencies. Are they still trying to reduce the amount of MPs down from 650 to 600? Because that was proposed.
No. That was proposed under Cameron, who said that he needed to do that to avoid waste. The reality was, as you say, gerrymandering at a time where we'd increased the number of lords, unelected lords. I mean, that chamber of Parliament today, is nearly 900 lords to 650 MPs. If you were looking at Britain from another country, you'd be thinking, hold on, people who influence lawmaking go unelected in Britain. Surely it should be the other way around, I would suggest.
Is there a limit on how many lords there can be then, obviously? You say 900. I've not really thought about the numbers.
There's a limit of hereditary lords at 99. The only bit of voting that goes on in the lords is for those lords who, quite simply because their mum and dad had sex, can enter into an election in the lords to go and sit there for life. As for the non-hereditary peers, there isn't a limit, no.
No, there isn't, but it's currently at around 900 at the moment. Mm-hmm. So that's something I hadn't really thought about, actually, other than the colour of their seats are red compared to green, which is an amazing differential fact between the House of Commons and Lords. There's another thing
we also have some similarities with some of those countries we don't like to name, like Saudi Arabia and Iran, where we too have religious officials who take and influence our lawmaking. There are still bishops who sit in the House of Lords, who vote and debate on legislation that's passing through.
So we have that, and we also have, we talked about voter ID and the access to voting, but also something even more radical is being proposed, as well as about changing the Fixed Term Parliament Act. So this gives this was last changed so that Prime Minister could also, and it has happened quite a few times during the 10s, hasn't it, call the general election early, but also it also sets the absolute amount of time before you have to call an election, which is it's set at 5 years. How would they really? I mean, that would be something absolutely major if it were made possible to become like Vladimir Putin or something and not have elections for so long. Would they really be able to push it back beyond 5 years, or change it so that the election couldn't be called? Because that's what some people are saying now about what they want to do, or Boris Johnson and the government or want to do with and his government want to do with the Fixed Term Parliament Act.
Well, two points there. We're already very much like Vladimir Putin. If the media don't like you, then they will hound you, and they will twist anything that you say against you, to the point where people in Britain genuinely believe that someone who was championing human rights abuses for decades was in fact a racist. I'm referring to Jeremy Corbyn there. They do it with other figures to deride them. So we've already got a media owned by a selection of very rich families who also have very cosy relationships. Barclay Brothers, for example, of the Telegraph, very cosy relationships with Johnson. So it's we're almost Russia in this way. Now, the Fixed Term Parliament Act may or may not surprise you, I don't know, but I personally, I'm all in favour of getting rid of it. Now, there is a convention in UK law that anyway, an election, your nominative period is 5 years. You cannot, the period between general elections cannot be any more than 5 years. If that was tampered with, I think people had hit the streets. I'm in favour of a 4-year term. But here's where the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which was designed to keep the Liberal Democrats and the Tories in bed with each other, which is sort of akin to being chained to someone you've divorced. It was designed to keep that pathetic government together between 2010 and 2015. The issue with it was you required 2/3 majorities to dissolve Parliament. You also had the very realistic problem, which is if you had a fractured Parliament, a hung Parliament, if you will, a dying Parliament, as we saw really under Theresa May's tenure. There isn't anything you can do unless all parties agree to hold an election, and you would have to stagger for years potentially. There are many other issues with the 5-year Parliament. Now, Prime Ministers have always called an election when they think it's favourable.
Yeah. 19, good example. Mm.
Well, yeah, but to be fair, that was done within the remit of the Fixed Term Parliament Act. More than 2/3 of the chamber voted for an election. I personally believe that was Jeremy Corbyn's critical mistake. I think he should have. I don't think he should have agreed to an election. But that's just my own view, and I have lots of reasons for it.
Shared by quite a few, yes, that one, obviously. So, well, what's the changes going to be, in theory, then? Because that's another thing. Why was it 5 years in the first place? Because it was obviously set. It was set at some point to always be 5 years max, wasn't it?
Well, 5 years in convention, parliamentary convention, etc., has always been in the legislative process in the Commons. So it was set for 5 years because that was the maximum amount of time. Again, it chained together. It chained up parliaments that might not have functioned for 5 years. To my knowledge, the Fixed Term Parliament Act is subject to repeal, and in theory, that should just be a repeal, and we would go back to a 5-year term, and that would obviously be from 2019. It wouldn't be 5 years from this date. But who knows? Look, the UK is very much like Hungary. There is a supermajority in Parliament. They can get away with essentially whatever they feel like. By and large, the public are relatively docile. Certainly for those of us who are campaigners and activists, cannot believe that more people aren't hitting the streets with the levels of corruption, etc. But as I say, the government are ploughing ahead with all sorts of things. Attacks on workers' rights again. We've got, we're not going to attack workers' rights. Oh no, now we are. We've got all of this, and the reality is there's not much we can do until there's a general election.
So really, you don't think it's going to put it beyond 5 years, or or because maybe some alarmist comments have been that we might actually be entering a situation where he could even do away with the election overall. So you just have perpetual Boris Johnson for the next 2 decades or something.
Well, looking at the way he operates, I think that's what he would like. But I don't know. Would enough people hit the streets? I mean, for example, if we had a week-long calling to work sick day or a general strike, as I would prefer, would that be sufficient to stop him basically with a power grab? There are also some people in his party that, like this idea of, British democracy, whatever that is, that might also make him think twice. But Johnson, you see, Johnson can get away with lying, he can get away with corruption, because he knows fundamentally that people don't really care, or seem not to care. Would rather be watching Mary Berry bake cakes than dealing with the fact that there is a corrupt government, even by Belarusian standards. I would go as far as to say. But in all seriousness, he knows that all he needs to do is call a few of his media friends, and they will portray it in a very different light. We've seen this happen again with voter registration. One conviction, 2.3 million people lose the right to vote unless they pay money. It's a tax, basically. It's an election tax, this. You have to pay for a passport or a driving licence to vote. It's another attack, and it's totalitarian tiptoe.
Yeah, and there's no other alternatives to that as well to prove your identity. It's just going to be those documents, those two. Yeah, that you have to use. So what does he want to do with the Fixed Term Parliament Act then, do you think?
Well, I haven't heard anything to the contrary, and I speak to a lot of MPs, certainly this week, councillors, advisors and what have you. So far as I understand, it is a straightforward repeal.
That's right. To achieve what?
To repeal the need, to repeal the necessity for a 2/3 majority, to remove the election every 5 years, to essentially go back to a system where a prime minister can call an election when they want, and it would be by a simple majority.
But there is still a maximum. There is still a maximum time, though, obviously, because he couldn't. Because when he would want could literally mean never, or virtually, couldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, my sense would be this. I think there's a bit of a longer game being played here. Certainly from inside the Labour Party, call this a scoop if you want. Most people expect Keir Starmer to be ousted in one of two ways. Either with the Betley and Span and Batley, by-election. If Labour loses that, he's gone. Or they expect that he will be gone by 2023. So you've then got a bit of a honeymoon period in a run-up to an election.
Well, we have had the by-election loss, haven't we? Because that happened during the local council elections, that there was also a by-election for the Hartlepool MP. And that's caused a lot of criticism for Keir Starmer because Hartlepool was even won in 2019. It wasn't a red wall loss for Labour then, and it's only just become one now in 2021.
Well, this is where this is where I think the irony of the Fixed Term Parliament repeal is it just needs a simple majority in Parliament to get rid of it. It doesn't need a 2/3 majority or anything like that. But my sense would be that Johnson would seek to go to the polls in 2023, and I think that's just in a bid to essentially keep Starmer as leader, to refresh his mandate. Effectively, Johnson's election in 2019 has been dominated for the past 2 years effectively by COVID, Brexit, which when tariffs begin to hit full force in July, the economy is going to take a battering. It already has by COVID. So my sense would be, well, if there isn't much of an opposition, then I want to go to the polls earlier. I'm just thinking, if I was an advisor to Johnson, go to the polls earlier. There will have to be either increases in taxes in the next year or two, perhaps. And I think that he would go before either increasing taxes or, as is more likely, cutting the entire welfare state and removing the NHS, which we know has been sold off left, right and centre, that he is wanting to go to the polls. Another thing, which is those cuts would in fact disproportionately affect the so-called red wall seats. I really don't like the term red wall. It assumes that people are brain dead and just tribal in certain seats, but I'll use it just for the argument.
Yeah. So, what do you think is going to happen with Keir Starmer then? Do you think you said you had something about that about what the Labour Party were planning there? Do you think his position's in danger now after that Hartlepool result?
I think if anyone ever played Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter, there is a point where a little message used to come up, finish him, as he's flagging around.
Oh, yeah.
What we're essentially in that position now. Angela Rayner, who threatened members who are leaving in the droves from the Labour Party, threatened party members, she would expel them, etc., etc., etc. We know the Ford report hasn't been released. That's investigations into some of the appalling behaviour from staffers in the Labour Party during Corbyn's tenure and after. He felt secure enough to sack her, but then he had to backtrack and give her a suite of other positions and other powers in the party, because the backlash from most quarters on the day after the last of the results come through, he says, I'll take responsibility for this. Appalling impression. And by taking personal responsibility, he goes to sack or remove all positions other than deputy leader, which he can't do. Goes to sack Angela Rayner. Within minutes, he essentially tried to assassinate someone and ended up mopping up his own blood splatter. What that told me, someone who's worked in politics and for quite a while, is he has zero political authority. And this is where we see Peter Mandelson, who is actively campaigning for Tony Blair to be the candidate in the Spen and Batley by-election.
A return to politics for Tony Blair, potentially, yeah. So with Keir Starmer, you don't really get much about what he's planning to do with the Labour Party. There's not been much talk about that, has there? About what the policies have been, are.
Well, still, I think his policy is to effectively destroy the Labour Party. I haven't seen the party in such a state, not even under Miliband was it in this state. People do not know what the party stands for. I haven't got a clue. There's no mandate. There's no manifesto. There's no we're going to do this. Nothing. It's just constantly, I'm not Jeremy Corbyn. Yes. Then we hear from his slime-ridden, could be killed off with salt friends, who then say, well, it's going to take much longer for this. I did find it somewhat ironic that the right-wing Labour Party group Labour to Win didn't. So you've got these people who keep on batting back to, we need to return to Blairism, which is soft, it's conservatism. So
soft
we run the risk of what's called PASOKification. This is named after the Greek Social Democratic Party. Some of you who are listening might remember PASOK from 2013, where you had the Troika imposing a variety of leaders and cuts on a country, and PASOK just essentially rolled over, agreeing to them. This saw the rise of Syriza, a left-wing political party which is currently the main opposition in Greece. The term PASOKification is used to describe the death of middling centre-left parties. In Germany, the Social Democratic Party of that country had a Tony Blair figure, Gerhard Schröder, and if you then look at his party today, with very weak policies, business-friendly, anti-union, really, anti-worker, to be blunt, they're currently polling at 14%, whereas the Green Party in Germany is polling at 26%, ahead of the ruling CDU. We're at the Labour Party, this once proud party that was the party of Labour, the party of workers, runs the risk of becoming a soft right party in which the main opposition, very seriously, could either be the Green Party, dependent upon what happens with the inevitable Scottish independence referendum. We might even see some challenges from the Northumbrian Independence Party, which I would write them off at your peril.
So yeah, the Northern Independence Party, they've just cropped up with the idea that, you know, the North could actually split off. Capital not decided on exactly whether it be Manchester or Leeds or Newcastle or something like that. And they've just put a few candidates in, but not exactly a huge amount into the local elections. So just before we kind of end on things, so what do you kind of think was responsible for the Hartlepool loss then? Given that it actually didn't go it didn't go to Tory in the 2019. And following all this pandemic and all the rest of it, could you really call Brexit still a factor in that? Well, you know, why would they out the Labour MP there? Do you think in the very working class Hartlepool?
Well, you've got a mixture of don't just. When answering this question, there's been some pretty insulting stuff on media, on Twitter, Facebook, that kind of stuff. Of some guy who said, you know, Labour shut down the prison a few years ago, shut down this.
Oh, not attributing the cuts to have come from central government, just blaming the council, which obviously gets its money from from central government, and not realising that. I can see why that sparked a bit of a reaction. Is that really the perception of most people?
I think it's a perception of some. There isn't. We're not very well politically educated anymore in Britain. If you compare that response, almost certainly you wouldn't hear it in France, where people are very much attuned with what's going on politically, and in a lot of countries across Europe. But I think it's just a minor point. Let's not. You know, when we talk about Hartlepoolians, we're not all talking about, you know, monkey hanging, politically illiterate people. So there's what I'm saying is there's not one answer. There's several. One, for sure, people who were engaged by Corbyn's message and the so-called Corbyn Labour Party, which is really just a sort of return to 1994, a little bit of nationalisation here and there, completely put off by Keir Starmer and stayed at home. A number of people who didn't know what Labour was stood for also stayed at home. Labour's result of 8,000 versus 2019, where it's circa 15,000, that's people staying at home. That's not people going to the Tories. It's people staying at home.
Shows how damaging it could be if there was a general election sooner and Keir Starmer took away the Jeremy Corbyn support, so to speak. It's kind of looking at what those sorts of results might be. It might be disastrous for Labour in many areas. Then.
The Brexit Party engaged and energised people who were equally politically homeless or were members of UKIP, the BNP, etc., where they attracted votes. That's not, that's not an insult. That is, there's a lot of research on this. But what we're finding is the Brexit Party, around 94% of those who voted for the Brexit Party are going to the Tories. About 5% of that is going to Labour. So yes, Brexit still playing a bit of an effect. And genuinely, I'm going to say this to the Northern Independence Party, which really didn't get anywhere. Uncosted manifesto, popular stuff, but it seems very gimmicky at the minute. I think that'll change. But what you've got is a complete lack of understanding of the north of England. You've got and various commentary on this, and this was someone from Hartlepool who, not a Labour voter by any means, I believe, but it was a comment. He came up, he ate fish and chips and had a pint of beer. Is that really what he thinks us Northerners are like?
If you do that, you're a shoo-in then, aren't you, to the election? Because you really are down to earth as soon as you enter a chip shop in the north.
Well, look, the Farage approach, genuinely, the way that he used to operate, it was, yes, the absolute pisshead in the pub who, wants, the sort of person who says, oh, Hitler wasn't all bad. One of those sorts of people. That's Farage's approach, and he has his followers. Having a pint and being one of the trendy people, it comes across as just directly insulting. Stop short of having a ferret down his trousers. No, wear your shiny suit, be your southern, lawyer, legal, whatever, barrister yourself. Don't pretend to be something that you're not. And I think that coupled with absolutely zero in terms of policies, governments don't need to come up with manifestos for by-elections because governments already have them. That's their legislative agenda. So we saw something where Brexit vote went to the Tories and the Labour vote, by and large, stayed at home, and yes, some went to the Greens, the Liberals. People vote very differently in local elections to by-elections, but we saw a sitting government increase its mandate. Now, that's unheard of. By-elections, produce some very odd results. Galloway thrives on them, for example. But in this instance, a combination of just insulting the electorate, dropping in and forcing a candidate, Saudi Paul, as he began to be called, who, again, didn't really understand the area, that kind of stuff. Parachuting people in. It turns out quite a popular idea is allowing local Labour parties to elect and decide themselves who it is should be representing them. Instead, it was a nomination of one person. It was forced upon them, and oddly enough, when that happens, the parachuting in of people, they tend not to do as well.
Did the local election results really matter? Because that was quite bad for Labour overall as well. Is that indicative as well as Hartlepool was of how it is under Starmer, or do they not matter that much?
Again, so if we look at the English local elections, which, if you just give me 1 second, there we go. So if you look at the English local elections, so you can have a look on Wikipedia's got some maps, the BBC have got some maps. So if you're listening to this recording, have a look at the maps. What you can see very clearly is in the northeast, the Tories really didn't do as well as might be expected, shall we say. They picked up seats, but yes, Durham went to no overall control. Hartlepool was already in no overall control, but yes, the Tories increased the number of councillors by 10 to 13 there. Labour lost 3. But by and large, in the northeast, the Tories had a good night, but it wasn't a clean sweep, if that makes sense. You had across the northwest of England and then over into Yorkshire, you've got this sort of central red belt, if you will, where local politicians made the difference. The reason I'm just bringing your attention, here's another thing as well. So if you go down to Kent, for example, so whilst the Tories still hold Kent, the Labour Party increased its number of seats by 2, and there were some peculiar results that came from the southeast. One last one to look at is Sefton Council and Preston councils. So a very close friend of mine, Sean Halsall, running a campaign for Labour, along with other councillors, increased the number of seats in Sefton by 6 up to 48, and Preston, Matt Brown, who is famed for what's known as the Preston model. And what this is a radical new look at the way that local services can be offered through cooperatives and what have you. They retained all of their seats. So my point is, we're beginning to see something I know I spoke to you about on the programme before, which is the national picture is breaking down. Elections cannot, and this applies to all of the parties, elections cannot operate, and it just will not operate the way that they once were, where there was this one big national image inclusive of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, national polls, national decisions. We are entering into a period of divisiveness, and what this is, one of the consequences or benefits, depends on your perspective, is the growth of regionalism. So when you look at what happened in the Northwest, for example, where Jackie Howard, I should say, again, took a Tory seat that no one really believed that it would ever go from Walkden North. That some of the seats, for example, in Salford would ever go from Tory to Labour. They did, and that's because there's local messages. Campaigns that were successful in these local elections have focused so much more about local elections and the regional devolved areas, and focused on issues that are affecting people. We haven't really seen that go on in previous local elections. Generally speaking, turnout is poor in local elections. People vote with the political flavour of the day. There's not much power in many local authorities, or people don't understand what power there is, I should say. This time it began to change. We really saw a lot more focus on, Andy Burnham, for example, re-elected Labour in Labour Mayor of Greater Manchester. Again, standing up to the Tories turns out to be a good thing if you vote Labour. Having some policies, wanting to nationalise the bus services, transport services in Greater Manchester turns out to be a good thing. That policy, obviously, let's go with nationalising the bus services in Greater Manchester, doesn't wash in Birmingham. So if you see what I'm saying, this really, this sort of regional identity politics is beginning to show. Again, in Bristol, Labour mayor elected against the odds, really. The Tories had a very good night. There were some unexpected surprises, as I say, from the Labour Party, but the Tories had a good night. And to be fair, next year's council elections are going to be even better for the Tories. We're going back. You've got bear in mind, the council elections go around in 4-year cycles. We're talking sort of peak Corbyn, so it'd be very difficult for Labour to retain what it had last time. Yeah, unless there's a radical change.
And there's also Mark Drakeford in Wales, so he renewed. So as you said, Sadiq Khan renewed as well as a London mayor. So they were, quite. And Andy Burnham, as you say, in Manchester. So actually, some people who had particularly obvious policies that could be identified, unlike with Keir Starmer, you can't really identify what exactly he might be doing. They tended to see the good results. So yeah.
Well, again, my take on this is it's like this. I should say, Jack, you didn't take a Tory seat. It was more representative of Salford, where there were some seats that changed hands. Just to put that on the record, if you will. But coming back to it, this is again what we saw. Left-wing policies. So again, we saw in Wales. That wasn't a victory for the Labour Party. It was a victory for the Welsh Labour Party, who had very clear policies, and they had a very good night. It wasn't a victory for Starmer, because we've seen constantly, whether it's on the doorstep or whatever else it is, who is Keir Starmer? What does he stand for? What does the Labour Party stand for anymore? And like it or not, people do engage with Trumpist Johnson. He's the sort of person that you could go and have a pint with, for example.
Right. Okay. So, and that's where we'll wrap it up. So that's we've had a look at Boris Johnson, what he's been up to recently, as we say, his decorating. And the possible changes through to the fixed term Parliament Act, what they actually want doesn't sound quite as alarmist, but also the idea of voter ID. So as I said, it could actually make it. It could tip it. It could tip the balance towards people who are more likely to vote Conservative if you have to show those forms of ID. He did say 2.3 million people that are without either passports or driving licenses.
Yes,
So,
it's a huge number. And again, look at it in a different way. This is a tax, a very clear tax on people's right to vote. And again, it's strange. Again, I'm just looking at some of the results around Greater Manchester. Just a few other points on the elections. Generally speaking, I mean, there's no Liberal Democrats now in Manchester. The Liberal Democrats seem to really be struggling. Tories lost a seat in Salford. Labour gained 3 seats in Trafford, and it's funny that with all of this, with all of these, gaining a seats, losing one, that kind of stuff, underpinned by a lot of left-wing policy and practice and campaigning, it's strange for me that these announcements around fixed-term parliaments, the announcements around voter suppression, essentially, we're talking about, comes straight after an election that has favoured, by and large, Johnson. You'd almost think that if he had a bad night, he would put that across as, oh well, it's obviously due to voter fraud. But it's not. It's sort of it's a little bit more sinister. It's more, I want a guarantee that I keep winning by pricing out the working class.
So one thing that they probably could claim as a success with the pandemic is, rather than the commentary he made about the bodies piling up, didn't he, and so on, and the amount of people who ended up dying as well, is the vaccination program that's been going on. That's been going on in record numbers. So, do you actually see that? Do you think this actually might be an end to it all? We've been this so-called roadmap. They've stuck to each part of it in terms of the loosening of restrictions. So, May 17th is just coming up, where you'll be able to go inside other people's homes again, and you can go to cinemas and go inside pubs and restaurants. And we just had the April 12 one, which is the opening of all the non-essential shops. So they haven't deviated at all. And the idea from June 21 was that pretty much all restrictions might be dropped, and maybe even the wearing of masks, I don't know, and social distancing. Do you think you've got this Indian variant now? Do you think actually it's not going to have all gone away, or do you think maybe we will be able to get out of it?
Well, what I've found somewhat amusing with the naysayers who said, no, we're going to be in a permanent lockdown, and this is Johnson's plan. Well, I just want to just remind a few people that it seems that the lockdown is coming to an end. The Indian variant is certainly of concern and shouldn't really have been able. It shouldn't really have been allowed to spread if we'd have had a solid policy, that had shut down airports and all of this during lockdown, which we didn't. There's lots of issues there. I mean, it is the rate of infection is on the rise with this variant. To my knowledge, though, there isn't any, other than it being more contagious. I haven't read anything yet that suggests that it's more deadly. It's just more contagious. This said, the issue with viruses is, once Once they're in the population, they do adapt, they do evolve. We could end up seeing, there are variants out there that the vaccine program don't guard 100% against. So my thoughts really on COVID is like this. I think that you're going to see a lot of certainly scare stories in the media who have profited handsomely. Certainly print media, which was dying, is suddenly revived by people staying at home and getting print copies and all of this again. You've seen then their online sales, and all of that's driven by more and more horror stories. I think you're going to start reading about vaccine viruses. People who've contracted viruses after being vaccinated. I think you're going to start seeing a lot more stories around that. Generally, though, I think that there'll be some weeks this summer, quite clearly, I know I've been cautious before, but quite clearly this virus is seasonal. I think we'll see a few weeks where the graphs, these morbid graphs that you see on the in the news nowadays, will start tracking with zero. But I do think there will be a bump up as we approach winter again.
Will they start bringing in restrictions again? Like lockdown type restrictions. We're kind of hoping to see the back of it for good, aren't we? But that sounds like even with all these people vaccinated, something like 36 million or whatever it is now with the first one. And then there's obviously conspiracy theories about what that might all be about and what might happen with people unvaccinated. But if it keeps coming back in autumn and winter, and there's a variant that might not be so effective against, that sounds like we could never get out of it.
Well, the question really is, can we go back to square one? Can we go back to going into work and to workplace sickness absence policies? Do we feel really comfortable sat next to someone who's ill but too frightened about losing their job or being punished for being off sick?
Like all through the 10s, yes. It used to be, it became, but people used to presenteeism, and they called it. People who would come in anyway, no matter what, and then, the more regular, like cold and flu stuff would get passed around.
Bradford equation stuff. All of these punitive arrangements in workplaces, quite simply so that some manager feels that they're in control, or some employer feels that they're in control. Do we want to go back to that? It's inevitable that if anything has happened, it's inevitable that people have learned a little bit more about the nature of virus and the spreading of viruses, etc. The key question is, how bad does it have to get before we do enter into another period of restriction? Whether that's lockdown, whether that's whatever, how bad does it have to get? Now, what we know is that Johnson, and I think this was a helpful leak, let the bodies pile high. I think he was playing to his core voters, that we'll never go into a lockdown again. I don't care if people die. And that seems to, some very perverse comments have picked up about that have been, well, exactly, people die anyway. I'm not interested in those people or anyone else who belongs to some sort of death cult like that. Any death above one is too much. But it comes down to the question: how bad does it have to get? Again, if you see what's going on in India, 400,000 people contracting per day. Just this morning, I was reading that I think the River Ganges, They have installed nets to collect the bodies of people who have died due to this disease. I mean, really, this is something apocalyptic in that country. The increasing collapse of health services. Now, I don't think that we're going in that direction, but it says a few things in terms of lessons. One, there's a reason why we don't have individual fire insurance policies anymore, because it turns out if next door's house is on fire, your house isn't going to be safe. So we're all covered by fire insurance, if you want to call it that. We call it the fire brigade. So it's not about means. The same principle also comes back. The same principle also comes back to the nature of this virus. Our neighbours, whether they're close or far, other countries, our own health response is only as strong as our weakest chain. So if we're looking at India, it is inevitable where there is an absolute outbreak that virus, the wave of that outbreak is going to cross borders. But how else did the virus originally end up in Britain? So do I think we're going to go into another period of restriction? Yes, it is possible. I don't think it will be, if we are, it'll be until winter time, where I think we're going to see another slight increase. But I believe that in the UK, we've seen the worst of this.
So also, I wonder why it came so strong in India, only in 21 and not last year. That's another thing. Just simply that. Why 21 for it to become such a crisis?
It's just, you've got different cultures, traditions, climate. There's many factors. A shortage of oxygen, shortage of treatment, vaccines, etc., etc. There's lots of complicating. The geography of a country can complicate spread of viruses, etc., etc. I mean, why did the Black Death not touch some Pyrenean mountain villages and some parts of Poland? It's just one of these. Geographies can matter. There's lots of different factors.
But it didn't happen last year, basically, when you'd think it would have happened at this time last year to India, wouldn't you? When it was really spreading into Italy, after it had done Italy and in China itself, and seemed to mostly miss India until the next year. So that must have an explanation behind it, or is it because they let their guard down quite a lot, or let go of restrictions quite a lot? I don't know.
Well, again, you could look at it another way. If some of the neighbouring countries have released restrictions, has that enabled the spread of viruses? Possibly. I don't think there's just one answer to that.
No, not an easy answer to reach, but we know how extreme it seemed to get as well, where the burning bodies and the streets sort of thing, having to get, no space in the hospitals, that sort of thing. And having a variant that might be we don't quite know how it's going to respond to these vaccines exactly, do we? So yeah, but they may well cover it quite well, and we won't see therefore much of a rise in autumn and winter compared to last, in 20, and therefore it might be much closer to being over. Therefore,
and again, the seasonal nature of this virus. I mean, if you have a look. There are some comparisons with other coronaviruses where you can see, there is a general increase anyway over winter time. I think almost certainly we'll see something like that. Unless there is a new variant that sidesteps things like vaccines, the knowledge and information that we have today. The awareness of the public, unless something horrific like that occurs, I do think we are well past the worst of this. But let's please remember that when you're looking at these morbid death counters, and please don't jump onto social media and go, "Oh, there were only 4 deaths today," or "only this." each one of those figures is a tragedy for someone's family, whether it's someone's grandma, mum, brother, sister, whomever it is. That's a tragedy for that family. Until we see zero, um, and again, I'd remind you that people die of other things as well. But until we start seeing zeros, any death above one is a tragedy.
Well, yes, and it's just looking at the objective picture of the amount of actual cases going down and so on. But obviously, it's a person each time. I mean, one person might be on the stats of being struck by lightning. That's a tragedy to that family in Blackpool where that happened just recently. A boy was struck by lightning. It's incredibly rare, but it's not to them, obviously. He was struck. Yeah. He was struck as doing football practice by a bolt of lightning, showing that does happen. So also, I don't know if this topic would work. I'll try to make it the last one, which is what Coronation Street have been covering, which is the about what happened in the late noughties was a group of young, should we say, almost like acting feral teenagers started picking on a young couple who were dressed in goth clothes. And this was in the Lancashire town of Bacup, and it happened in a park. They beat them to death, and Coronation Street has replicated this storyline by having a storyline involving Seb and Nina. So I won't reveal too many spoilers. You haven't been watching it. So what do you think about the way that this sort of thing is policed? So you've got that people will do that sort of thing. They will pick on someone like that, and
well, I'm not too familiar with the storyline. To be fair, but I'm not a viewer of Coronation Street. But it sounds to me as the storyline is effectively around what, bullying, is it?
Well, yes, essentially, they were beaten up in this Lancashire town. In the park, just because they looked and acted differently, and that's the sort of. So what's interesting now is that we have we should be entering a time of tolerance for people who are different and or not really different, but but we've seen a time in the 10s where we've had the increase of disability hate crime, for example, at a time where we should be stamping out racism, we've seen a rise in hate crime. So I'm just wondering if we can trace that back to politics moving to the right.
Well, yes. I mean, someone from the LGBT community, I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone, but I'm just saying I'm very familiar with a lot of hate attacks, some acid attacks against people because they are suspected, not necessarily that they are LGBT. You don't need to look far at all to see the increase in racist attacks and xenophobia broadly in the UK. I think if Coronation Street is bringing attention to things like that, it's helpful. But yes, there is a link. What you find in periods of relative prosperity and spending by governments and others, there is an increase in freedoms. Where there are cuts, there is an increase in totalitarianism and intolerance. That's, believe it or not, that used to be taught in American schools up until really Reagan. The link between prosperity and recession, if you will. Yes, the idea of someone looking different. Well, what do we want really? If any of you are listening to this thinking, I know, well, I always beat people up or slag people off for being different. Yeah, Well, what do you want? A clone? Yeah, a cloned race where everyone looks the same and thinks the same.
Well, they kind of do, don't they? These people, actually. See, what's interesting about some of the what you call them, could call them feral teenagers or scallies or neds, is they actually have a group conformity over what gear they think is cool to wear and what you're supposed to be into, even down to music, and therefore they've attacked people of the goth subculture because of their what they're typically like. So it's a tribalism. They seem to. It's kind of a demand of conformity, as if they're like a sort of army, and they're trying to sort of conform other people into. You don't act like this because you're weird, and if we find out you're weird, we're going to target you now. Sort of thing. So it's the opposite of tolerance.
Well, yeah, and I suppose that message is, we keep teaching kids about things like war, which is often born about in history due to intolerance on religious basis, or just because some king and emperors fell out with their cousin / brother / whatever. The key is we should be celebrating diversity, that we don't live on a planet where there's just one species of animal, one species of tree, one species of dog, so there is no difference. One of these things, and yes, ultimately, I don't understand what sort of mental state you must be in to wish to attack someone simply for looking or thinking or dressing differently to you. If you believe that you're in the master race because you think everyone should look like you, I'd probably suggest that fortunately you're much less likely to procreate, and perhaps the survival of the species, in fact, depends upon you not doing so. We should be celebrating diversity, and if you're thinking that it might be a contrast in me saying we should celebrate diversity but not fascism, it's dead simple. It really is very simple. My fundamental belief is this: everybody should have freedom to express themselves however they wish. If your main belief is wishing to take away someone's freedom of expression, then you shouldn't have it in the first place.
What's interesting is that it's kind of on similar lines to racism, really. We're saying, about people saying, "Oh, we're British here, and we find the French weird, or we find these people who are of a different religion or looking different." It's no different. It's no different from any of that, really. But I'm just wondering whether whether politically things are getting more intolerant. So,
well, I'm sure,
rather than the other way around.
Even with the debate about fishing right now and what was going on in Jersey and the sending gunboats and all the rest of it. Yeah, well, do you know what? One of the best ways to form a decision isn't to castigate an entire country and its population, but perhaps you might wish to speak to some fishermen who are involved and form your view on that, and perhaps actually speak to people. And those people who are intolerant of other countries and cultures, I won't ever listen to your nonsense, but perhaps it might be an idea to get off your backside and go and explore those cultures, because quite often I always think that the cure for racism and xenophobia is travel.
Which is going to be a bit more restricted, but hopefully opening up. We've got the red list of countries, and they've done this traffic light system, haven't they?
Well, if the future, if the cure for racism is travel, regrettably, I have to inform you the other perk of that is you might have a right to vote.
Okay, so we've had our thoughts on that. I'd like to thank you, Jay Martin, for appearing on the 107th Street to talk about all that's current at the moment in the politics.
Thank you very much.
That was the insights of Jay Martin on our world. Society and politics. The Jay Martin interview.